Welcome to this episode of the Level Design Podcast. In this episode, we'll be welcoming back one of our panelists from EGX, Jon McKellan from NoCode. Welcome to the show! Hey John, welcome.
Indeed.
And we have two Johns today. Oh well, Jonathan and John. So hopefully I won't get confused.
Yeah.
That's John,
The
for
accent will be
our
different,
dear
yeah.
listeners. Jonathan, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, you are on the deeds of the
Yeah.
podcast, so like
By this point, yeah.
By this point, we have to have you on. It's kind of like on your contract, isn't it? We just kind of came back from EGX, where we all sat on a panel in front of so many people. That was quite impressive, and we're really lucky to have Jon McKellan from NoCode, which as a studio I hadn't heard from before. But I had heard of the awesome games that you're doing, mainly through Stories Untold by Devolver.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, where were you at before NoCode? So what's your background, John?
Well, I've been in game dev for just over a decade now, I think, and worked in a couple of big AAA studios, basically. So I worked at Rockstar for a little while. Spent most of my time at Creative Assembly working on Alien Isolation.
Right.
That was that became my calling card, that game. And before that, I worked on APB, the ill-fated MMO that was made by Real Time Worlds up in Dundee.
Okay.
So that was my first bit of game dev. But I mean, before that, I'd been doing graphic design for years before I actually got into games. I was a graphic designer for a long time, and motion graphic design. And then fell into game dev, not by accident, but when I wanted to make games when I was younger, there was no jobs for graphic designers. It was just programmers and 3D artists. And then my brother-in-law got a job at Real Time Worlds and said they were looking for a graphic designer for the UI. And I was like, oh, I can do stuff like that. And then applied, not thinking I would get anywhere, and got the job. And that's it. The rest is kind of history from there. Just got my head down and started doing more than I should. Putting my nose in lots of people's business and trying to make games better. And then eventually, people started listening, which was good.
I think now I understand your background as a graphic designer. I understand a lot more of the puzzles and observation. They're beautifully designed. I think if anyone hasn't played it, Observation is I guess a puzzle game.
Yeah, puzzle adventure type thing, yeah.
It's a puzzle adventure game. Like a big part of it is a 3D. You're in a space station, the ISS essentially, not called the ISS, but essentially it's the ISS, isn't it?
The interior is based on the interior of the ISS, different shape and stuff like that. But yeah.
But it's very much. I mean, it's completely inspired. The references in it are spot on, but also it has a number of technical puzzles within it, which I've never seen that kind of great design of the puzzle itself. It looks like so well researched from the reference materials.
Yeah, I mean that was a goal right from the start. Was myself and my brother Graham, who's the lead designer. The goal was to make sure that the puzzles always reflected the narrative, always reflected the tech behind what was supposed to be happening. It's too often you'll get puzzles in adventure games that are completely disparate and disconnected from the narrative, and it's like I think like Resident Evil was a classic where you're fighting off zombies in a police station, but you also stick gems in a fountain and stuff like that, and it's very like
right.
They're kind of out there and not really relevant to the theme. And so for Observation, what we wanted to make sure was that every puzzle was like deeply integrated into the story, into the world, and that included things like the UI design. So a lot of that stuff came from like me doodling in Illustrator and creating what I thought would look cool as an interface to use, and then we'd start to work out, well, what's the science behind this? What's the purpose of this puzzle? Like, what you're trying to achieve? And slowly we'd pull all these references together. So we've got like a stack of books in our bookshelf of like NASA reference guides and all sorts of stuff that we'll probably never ever look at again. It's like this big one-time library, but it meant that we could put a lot of attention to detail into every single icon.
With that kind of approach to the puzzles as well, is that what kind of made you decide to have Sam is the main character, so to play from the AI's point of view, or was that already decided before you went for those styles of puzzles?
Yeah, for Sam, I mean, that was already decided, like, right from the start. The goal was to basically do 2001, but have you play as Hal and see what it was like.
Right.
Just to question that, like, when you watch 2001 or you watch Alien, stuff like that, like flipping your perspective on things and asking what that person was going through is a really interesting thing to do. It's a really interesting thing to practice on. And I'd read an article years ago, I think it was just as Alien Isolation shipped, and it talked about the original Alien film, and it had written a version of this from the alien's perspective, and it was like, let's talk about what the alien went through on that film. It's like, it was born on this weird space station with a bunch of weird humans, and they tried to kill it right away, and then they chased it with a cattle prod, and then they tried to flush it out of an airlock, and this thing had like a really horrible life. And it was just trying to feed, it was just trying to stay alive, and it was like, obviously it's a total villain in the film, but just flipping the perspective on it made it quite interesting. I was like, I'd never really thought about that film at all in that way. And so I started thinking, like, well, what other kind of things can you apply that to in 2001? Like, I'm a huge fan of the film and the visual style and stuff, and it just felt like a natural fit. It was like, well, what's it like for Hal to suddenly be self-aware and feel feelings for the first time and be expected to look after crew he's never met, and all these kind of themes that you don't really entertain while watching the film, So that's kind of where all that came from. But it also meant that I could basically make the UI the star of the show and play to my strengths rather than anything else. It's funny because a lot of people I've worked with in the past in AAA had said that. They were like, you can tell it's a Jon McKellan game because he's made the UI the main attraction instead of everyone else.
But it gives it its own, like, I guess, unique style as well. And I think it's always nice to see not playing from like a traditional perspective of your standard hero or your standard first person kind of like shooter sort of thing. You play as this AI that is kind of more fixed, but you can still explore the ship, which is also quite interesting. It's just done in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, it just gave us a lot of opportunities that for gameplay and for narrative that I think hadn't really been done, and we hadn't seen any, at least recent examples of that kind of thing. So yeah, it was like there's loads of things you would normally rely on that you just couldn't do. So it was like, well, now we've got to think of justifications for all these different things. But that was part of the fun, part of the challenge, and part of the fun.
There's a lot of great parts for Sam to travel through the ship as well, which kind of ties back to what you're saying about Alien. That there's areas that you have to be going through, like the air vents.
Yeah, that came later on in development. We knew you would be flying around the station, but it was just this idea of technically Sam is flying around inside himself, and finding these kind of nooks and crannies and bits of himself that he didn't know before. And there was a kind of nice vibe to that, and letting the player actually inspect the ship and feel a little sense of freedom gradually as the game goes on kind of represents Sam's, mental journey, where he starts off as this fixed robotic, unable to move thing, and then by the end of the game he's able to go anywhere he wants and interact with things anywhere he wants, and that shows that kind of development.
And even which I found from kind of a level design perspective, he is quite constrained at the beginning, as you say, but then you get to a point that how can I put it? You have got total freedom because you're outside.
Yeah.
And actually the challenge there is not like, hey, get from here to here. It's like, you are a big boy now. You figure out which one is the Russian side. I can't remember the actual mission from the top of my head, but you go and find out where this thing is. You've never seen this thing, which is a really interesting metaphorical leap into space.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, you're a lot of the game design and puzzle design is about, like, we do it a little bit in Stories Untold, but especially in Observation, is kind of like presenting the player with a piece of technology, an interface, and maybe a fraction of an instruction manual, and saying go, go figure it out. That's a puzzle. The actual puzzles themselves are quite simple. The puzzle is working out what it is you're being asked to do and how to go about it. And what makes, I think, Observation quite interesting is that all the other characters in the game expect Sam to know the answer. Like, Sam's supposed to be really clever and like this supercomputer. It's kind of like, it's like if you were to ask Alexa or Siri to do something and she said back, I don't really know, hang on. It would be really, you'd be like, oh, shit, well, she does say that sometimes. But that brought this kind of interesting idea where, like you say, you get pushed out into space and told, go fix this thing. And you're like, I don't know how to fix this thing. It's like, well, it's up to you. You go do it, and the expectation is on you. So it kind of puts the player and Sam in the same situation, which is a theme that runs throughout the game throughout that experience is to make sure that the player and Sam are roughly feeling the same thing in terms of how they're being talked to, how they're being treated, what they're being asked to do.
Yeah, it's got some amazing parallels, but also, as you mentioned, in Stories Untold. And again, the puzzles in that, very nicely designed. That was through Devolver, wasn't it?
Yeah, both games through Devolver, yeah.
Oh, both of them, yeah.
Yeah, both of them, yeah. We started working with Devolver and Sony on Observation, and whilst we were waiting on the contracts getting signed, we made Stories Untold because we had nothing else to do.
It's a nice little stopgap.
Yeah. It was like we were waiting, and it was just like, because we had Sony and Devolver involved, there was this 3-way contract, and it's super complicated, and big company. Devolver are really speedy, but Sony are a huge company, so things tend to take a bit longer. And then we done the first story of Stories Untold, The House Abandoned, we'd done as a game jam for Ludum Dare. And it went viral. Like, we'd done that in like 3 days, and then it suddenly went viral, and Kotaku picked up on it, and suddenly it was this huge thing. And it only took us a couple of days to make it, so we thought, well, we could make more of these. Like, that was really fun. We enjoyed it. It was like a 3-day, 4-day maybe experiment of a different type of storytelling. And we developed a little bit of tech that would be useful in Observation. So I phoned up Devolver and said, this has gone huge. What do you think? What do you think of us doing a couple more, and we'll package it up as an anthology? And they were really into it, and they were like, yeah, that sounds really cool. Like, let's do it. And I was saying, yeah, I mean, it took us 3 days to do that one, so it's probably going to be like a month or something to do the whole thing. Obviously, that was 6 months, and I was completely wrong.
Yeah, I was going to say, what was the actual time scale it turned into? But even that's still not bad.
No, that's amazing.
Yeah, I think we said it was going to be 24 days, but it was actually like 182 or something. But it was a really good experience to make that and road test a lot of the ideas that, technically that went into Stories into Observation as well. Sorry, we got to build some tech, and we got to experiment with, how to do stuff we'd never done before.
I think it is a good way. If you've got a secondary project you can do along the side, you can always think of testing features, or at least start building them on that project, and you can obviously refine them on the next one, but at least you've got a good base to start from, and you already know their work. So
absolutely. And for us, it gave us a lot of confidence as well, because I had these ideas for Observation Story, for some of the puzzles, and the way that we were talking about designing puzzles, about these kind of bits of technology that you interact with, and there's a part of you that's going, well, maybe this is just like super geeky and nobody's going to like it. And then we released Stories Untold, and it got lots of good reviews, and it got lots of sales, and people really liked it. And we thought, okay, starting Observation didn't feel quite as daunting, even though it was a much bigger project.
Yeah, because you'd already tested the waters a little bit with some of those ideas beforehand.
Absolutely, we dipped our toe in, and people liked the idea of it. So yeah, it meant that we started off. I mean, we literally shipped Stories Untold and started Observation like the next day.
Wow.
Due to the way it was like we shipped it, and then we got the contracts back like a couple of days later when we got back from GDC, and then that was it, straight onto Observation. So, but we went in that with like lots of adrenaline and lots of like, right, cool, maybe we are doing something quite cool and people will like this. So yeah, so that was good.
That's amazing. I for some reason I thought it was like you'd started NoCode. You started NoCode with your brother, right?
No, with my friend. Well, I've known him for 30 whatever years, so he's like a brother. Omar. Omar's the managing director to my creative director of NoCode.
Oh, okay.
My brother Graham, he was kind of working part-time with us. He was a school teacher for years and years, working part-time with us in the evenings on Stories Untold, designing some of the puzzles, doing some of the implementation, and then once Observation got fully signed and funded, then we could take him on full-time, and he switched career from teacher to game dev.
Wow, that's not a leap I've heard before.
No, it's quite a different one. Yeah.
It's usually the other way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
yeah, true. Yeah,
go into academia once you're bored of making games. But he was he was teaching high school, and the really fun thing was for Observation, he had got his degree in astronomy and physics, and so a lot of his knowledge literally, for the first time in his life, had fully come into use working on Observation. He's like, I know this stuff. Like, we can make this technically.
I can finally use all this stuff on people that might really appreciate it.
Yeah, so the attention to detail, like, it was like, oh, we've got a scientific advisor in-house. This is great, you know.
Well, there's that side of the budget that you didn't have to spend, right?
Exactly, yeah. So that was cool, and yeah, and then we started expanding the team and so.
I made the misunderstanding that you kind of started small with Super Arclight, an iOS Android game, right?
Yeah,
It's
that's
like
right.
It's more of a arcadey game, I guess.
Totally. Yeah. It's a really kind of straightforward one button tap arcade thing. I mean, when we started NoCode, we started with observation in mind. Like that was the game I wanted to make, and kind of the reason why I wanted to start the company. Obviously, raising money, raising a team, proving that you're capable. These were all things we had to kind of, get through.
Prove.
Yeah,
Right.
we had to prove ourselves. Yeah. So when we originally started, we were doing a lot of contract work for Microsoft for Crackdown and stuff like that. So still doing a lot of UI work. Omar's our audio director, so he was doing some audio work, and we were just doing that stuff to kind of keep the fires burning while we work on our own projects. So we done Super Arclight within the first couple of months. We had got our first builds ready for that. Yeah, that was in the end of 2015, I think, and then we released that through Channel 4, of all people.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
how did that come about?
Yeah, so I don't know if you've met Colin McDonald before. He was the game director at Channel 4.
No.
So Colin, he's been around since forever. He was at DMA on the original Grand Theft Auto. He was a studio manager at Real Time Worlds and stuff like that, and we've kept in touch. And he's a great guy, and he was doing all the Channel 4 licensed games, but as part of his arrangement, he was allowed to sign, I think it was like 3 or 4 games a year that weren't licensed and were just original games. And Stories Untold was one of their kind of first picks for that, which was really cool. So yeah, so we ended up, like, it's a really basic game, but it's still quite fun.
Mhm.
And Apple picked it up, and it was their editor's choice that week, so it just suddenly got huge. And that was just me and Omar, for that point. So that first year was really just me and Omar doing everything ourselves. And then as we started to put together our prototype for Observation, and then the game jams for Stories Untold, that's when things started to build up.
I find it very interesting that we all have that game that we are really doing, and then we kind of have side projects whilst we're making the big game.
Yeah.
Or small indies, or I guess not like. Well, I guess a lot of companies sometimes do this. I mean, Alien Isolation might be an example of this, because this was done by Creative Assembly, right? That are doing a whole bunch of other games.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, it was a weird game for them to make, because when Real Time World shut down, Creative Assembly had come up to Dundee to try and help out some of those that had been made redundant, and I'd interviewed with them, and they were really keen to get me down, and it was a big move and stuff, and they couldn't tell me what it was I was going to work on, but I was like, I'm not, like, I think I know they're very good games, but I'm not a big fan of like strategy games like Total War.
Mhm.
I don't get much out of them myself, and so I wasn't like, I don't really want to spend years of my life making icons for a strategy game. It just wasn't my thing, and they were like, no, this one's different, and like Alien was a completely different type of project for that team to make.
Yeah,
and it was a separate team.
Yeah.
Like, to be fair, it's like they have a console team and they have the Total War team, so it's a very different bunch of people working on that. But yeah, you just didn't expect it to come from there at all, and yeah, then it just showed you, because it came out, it was Game of the Year pretty much everywhere, and it was you would never think it would have come from Creative Assembly, but yeah, there you go.
Which is kind of leads me to my next question, was what are the challenges of using, because I know they had access, or you had access to a lot of Fox's back archives and
Yeah.
things that you'd seen in the film and the designs for the film, and that's a holy trove of design, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was terabytes of stuff that had never been seen, and it's like when photographers take 1,000 photographs and then pick the 2 that get shown publicly. We got to see the other 998.
Wow. Okay.
Of which most of them are really dull and just bad versions of the ones you've already seen. But
Right.
But there were still loads of really interesting things that either had just been like lost and never, or not lost, but like archived and never really used, or bookmarked to be used in a future publication or something like that. So yeah, we got to see things like continuity Polaroids, stuff like that, which were just like incredible to see for me as a fan, let alone as someone making a game.
It must be very challenging, because that 70s design that really imbued all of that game, that very Alien, actually. I mean, I know it follows Alien Isolation, but that very, very 70s rather than Aliens
Yes.
style that kind of imbues the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, we were really specific to even going to the point where a lot of us deliberately didn't watch anything other than Alien whilst we were working on it, so that we didn't kind of like contaminate our minds with the stuff from the second and third film.
Wow. Okay.
It's a good approach though. It's a sensible approach because it keeps you all on the same page.
Yeah, that was it. It was like, because we weren't joking. We used to talk about it in the the press junkets and stuff, that we'd have Alien running on loop in the studio, and that wasn't a joke. Like, we literally had screens with the film running just on loop day after day for months on end.
Just brainwash yourselves.
Yeah, literally. It's like you turn around and you were just constantly having this in the background, and it was it was usually muted or whatever, but you're just constantly aware of it, and it just kind of kept you in there. And it got to the point wherever you saw something from the second film or the third film, like, even if you weren't on the art team, where you're the art team are obviously a bit more trained to see the differences or the more subtle differences. I think everyone could see the difference by the end of that project, could tell from a single frame grab or still what era that was from, because they are so distinctly different in the way that they're produced. So yeah, we were very, very strict on it has to look like the 1979 Alien. And I think there was even like all of our props and anything new that we had to design, we had a rule where it had to be something you could make on set in 1979. But it really paid off, because it meant that we had this really consistent, believable world. Even though it's sci-fi and it's fantasy essentially, it still felt grounded and relatable, because you'd seen that stuff so much growing up.
Because it is literally set, I guess, in the Aliens universe, literally set after Alien.
Yeah, it's kind of set a little bit after, but we're not at the point where we've got colonial marines everywhere and pulse rifles and all that stuff. It was just like, that was completely like...
It's like doing like if you think about it, like a 50 years difference. It's like showing, people in World War One versus people in like World War Two, and you're going like, yeah, well, I can tell that there's a difference between a biplane and a...
Exactly, yeah. You would see
and a Spitfire.
So we were on that first side of it where we kept everything creative, as close as we could, but it gave you a little bit of creative license to, increase the tech a little bit if you needed to. You didn't have to be too slavish if you were inventing something new, because you've got 20 years worth of potential, things have happened in the world. So it meant you could move things forward a little bit, which is nice.
That's a nice challenge to have, but also a nice... That sounds like a lovely solution to it, to say, like, anything that's going to be designed, anything that's going to be built would have to be built in 1979. We're not going to use, like, I don't know, a speak and spell from the 87 or something like that as a basis of a prop or something like that.
Yeah, just creating these rules just help, take away the blank canvas where you're worried about where to start or what you're going to begin with. It gives you a framework to work within, and that's always a lot easier, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that again, I'm a massive fan of that, and you can see some of that in, again, going back to observation, because as you said, you had that library, right? And that's kind of what were your rules for designing in observation?
Yeah, so we've got this library of books and reference material for pretty much everything from like Apollo program onwards. But we'd set our game, I think it's 2026 it's set in, so we have, at the time of development, 7-8 years difference. So our rule was like, it needs to look like something that could exist on the ISS. I mean, the ISS has been up there for 20 years, and so it's got to look like it belongs there. So there was a thing like the ISS, like I say, it's been up there for 20 years, so they've got some really old technology up there. It's like 20 years old, it still works, and there's no point replacing it, because replacing it is extortionate. Like, if a laptop does what it needs to do, it's okay if it's a ThinkPad from 98. You're
not going to just chuck it back, right? You're not going to go, hey, whilst you're going back, can you take this?
You just chuck another one up. Yeah, it's like the amount of money that it would take to replace anything is huge. So they only do it if they need to. So we had that kind of rule, is like, it's okay to mix anything back until like 2000, I think, onwards was kind of like, okay, if it's within that time frame, it's okay. So it's okay to have things like analog video feeds, which they still use in the exterior of the ISS, as well as digital video feeds, which are used in some of the newer internal stuff. So we would mix that. So the Sphere camera that you get in the game is very digital in its post-processing. The room cameras are all VHS, they're all analog video feed. And so we just try and theme the technology based on like, well, maybe the room cameras would have been installed at the beginning, when they first put these modules in. So the room cameras are embedded, so they'll be older. The handheld stuff might be newer because it's maybe been replaced in the last 10, 15 years and stuff like that. So there was kind of rules like that we'd use. And then, of course, because we've got this 6-7 year gap between now and when the game takes place, you can push some technology forward a little bit if it helps maybe sell a narrative concept or get round a potential narrative issue or plot issue where, you've kind of got communications that need to happen instantaneously, but we can't really do that yet. But maybe in 5 years' time, we'll have developed something, that will allow that. So we had this theory of, I think it was quantum comms was one of the things you use in the game. There's meant to be, quantum computing used for communication, which would allow it to be instantaneous. And it's not actually that far-fetched because we're almost there. And so our thinking was, well, in our 2026, we've got there, and we're capable of that part of it. And it meant we could have communications with ground control, even though we're out in the out around Saturn, where it would take normally 90 minutes for a call and response. So it was like,
and in a game, that's going to be completely boring. It's like, you've sent a message, now you have to play for an hour.
That was originally one of the ideas. You would have to send a message and then do a bunch of other stuff, and then 90 minutes later we'd come back. But it was just like, we're being a bit too strict here.
Yeah.
I think that's the other thing as well. Like, you can look to build in the believability of stuff like that, but I think you'd already set out all these rules, so you had the wiggle room, and it helps you kind of move forward a lot as well.
Something you said earlier, which was that at NoCode, you guys were all working as an external studio, working on other games as a contracting studio.
Yeah, just at the very beginning. Yeah, for the first 9 months, maybe leaving Rockstar North to start your own studio was pretty scary, and then everyone tells you you're crazy because Rockstar North is probably the safest studio as far as job security goes.
I hear they've got one or two, Bob. Yeah.
Yeah, apparently they do the odd game, and people are just like, "You're nuts, leaving this." And I was like, "Well, I really want to do this thing." And we'd spoke to Dave Jones, who's the original GTA guy, and was also running and done Crackdown and stuff like that. And he was my boss years ago, and I reached out to him to say, like, I want to start my own company, but I don't know, like, how? I don't know what to do. Can you give me some advice? And he's like, yeah, I'll give you some advice. And also, if you want a contract, I need someone of your skills to help out on Crackdown. So you could do that remotely and still work on your own stuff, but it gives you that little safety net. So when you start your studio, you're spending 2.5, 3 days a week working on stuff for them, but at least you've still got a wage and you've got the freedom to pursue whatever it is you want to pursue, which was the big problem with, working at Rockstar, for example, is just you can't work on anything else. That's part of your contract is to...
I think that's the important thing as well, having that safety net. If you're going to go independent or try and start your own studio, if you can land a contract like you were fortunate enough to do with the Crackdown stuff and take those 2 days a week to then really sit down and think about what it is you want to build up, like, it puts you in a nice position.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have done it otherwise. Like, I just had my third kid and was talking to my wife about leaving my job, so that was obviously stressful.
That's a conversation.
Yeah, you got a 1 month old and you're like, I think I'm quitting my job. It's like what? But it was because we had this potential kind of freelance work or outsourcing work that meant that we'd have a contract, we'd have a retainer every month, so I kind of guaranteed wage coming in. I couldn't really have done it otherwise. I think if it wasn't for him giving us that opportunity, then it would have been a very different couple of years.
So how, obviously starting out doing the contract work for the first 9 months, how rapidly did the team build? Like, did the team grow up to getting to the observation?
Not much. I mean, we hired a kind of junior programmer about 6 months in, just because because we were spending like 2-3 days a week on this other stuff. As soon as we had our own deadlines, like the Super Arclight for Channel 4, we kind of like, well, there's a bunch of stuff now that we now actually have to deliver stuff and having to juggle things. So we hired a guy to help out with some of the stuff we didn't know, things like safe game stuff and platform support. And then when it came to Stories Untold, so we worked on the observation prototype, and that was just me and Omar doing all of that pretty much. And it was still just me, Omar, and our programmer guy and Graham helping out now and then until Stories Untold shipped. And then that's when we went on the the hiring spree because we had the full budget for the game. So that's when the team scaled rapidly from that point. So, Graham had been doing a bunch of stuff. And we'd worked with a bunch of guys I used to work with on Alien to do some art stuff. And they were just contractors, we're just paying them as we needed them sort of thing. And then, once we got to Observation, it was just like a really rapid scale up. We went from 3 people to 12 people in the space of a year, I think, just under that.
That's not too bad as a growth for a company. It's fairly sustainable, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a huge number, but it's a massive shift in your, I'd say studio culture, but it was just like 2 of us, so... It's like,
well, I mean, it's in your working practices and the idea that instead of it's just you and somebody else, it's now like 12 people.
There's suddenly a bunch of people who need you to do stuff for them, who need paid and who need, who are asking when you can take holidays and stuff like that, and a whole bunch of problems you never had before. And it definitely kind of, hit us in the first couple of months of having a bigger team, just like, all these other jobs and things we had to consider that we just never really had to consider before. We're now a time sink, and we have to kind of start managing that along with our coalface work of actually making games, And I've been, for the first game, I handled, like Omar handled some of the implementation of design and all the audio and music, but I was doing pretty much everything else. And so giving some of that away was quite hard as well. Like, I'm not going to do this stuff anymore. I'm going to hand it to this person and then give them feedback. So that was kind of strange and took a while to get used to, but I think I've got a good balance now, I think.
Talk about NoCode expanding. You're hiring at the moment.
We are, yes, yeah.
So dear listener, if you go to nocodestudio.com/jobs, you'll see what they're hiring. And please do it relatively near when we're doing this podcast, because otherwise it'll be like 8 years down the line going, there's no jobs, or there's loads of jobs. Well, hopefully there's loads of jobs at NoCode in 8 years, but... So what next? Can you tell us what's happening next? Are you working on a new title? Are you just resting on your laurels for...
Yeah, no resting, unfortunately. Yeah, we've got a couple of things happening. We're putting together our next big thing, which we can't really go into any detail in.
Of course.
But is a little bit of a departure from what we've done before, and technically a lot more challenging and complicated than what we've done before. So a lot of the last kind of 6 months since Observation came out has been kind of tech exploration and a lot of learning. We're switching to Unreal as well, which is interesting, and throwing up all sorts of challenges, positive and otherwise. So a lot of that has been done, but we're also porting Observation because it's going to be on Steam and Xbox next year. So we're getting those builds ready and kind of clearing house that way as well.
There's a weird thing, and this is kind of just off the side, but it's like there's some controversy over exclusives and stuff. But from a production point of view, to me it sounds great, because you can actually get something out there, and then you have to worry about all the other platforms.
Yeah, there's definitely a team our size. I think even though like PS4 Pro and Xbox One X are pretty comparable in terms of what they can achieve, there's still fundamental differences that make it a challenge, to make your game run on both seamlessly. So it meant that we could release a game in the state that we wanted, and then dig into these other platforms and make sure that we do a decent job on them for when the time comes. Yeah, so now we're looking at that, and also looking at those platforms potentially for Stories Untold as well. So we might see a little resurgence of Stories Untold coming to console soon, which would be nice.
Awesome. How can people get hold of you, John? How's the best way?
Usually just through Twitter. That's my thing. Yeah.
John_NoCode.
Yeah. John_NoCode. Yeah. Or the official NoCode is just _NoCode. We are a bit of a liar. We do have code. We've got 2 coders, and they're very good and very essential.
I expect no less.
Yeah. But when we started, we talked about starting a studio, and a good friend of ours said, "Well, who's going to be your coder?" And we said, "Well, we don't have any," because we were making demos and stuff using Playmaker and visual scripting. And he's like, you can't have a studio with no code. And we're like, ding, there's the name. And so that's where it came from. But yeah, and then about 3 months later, we hired a coder. So but some code isn't catchy, so
yeah.
The way it was.
No, but that's an excellent name. If they have questions, they can contact you on Twitter. They can contact us on Level Design FM. If you're not subscribed, I don't know how you're listening to this, but you should subscribe. We're on iTunes and Spotify and most of the podcatchers out there. And we shall be seeing everyone in the next episode. Bye!